Hi, I'm Tom Payton, Director and Publisher at Trinity University Press. Welcome to the Maverick Book Club. The books we discuss in this event series explore the rich histories and stories of Texas. As a nonprofit, community-focused, educational publisher, we are committed to an evolving agenda of work that engages, questions, and brings us together as a community in effective and productive ways. We've come together today to discuss West Side Rising, how San Antonio's 1921 flood devastated the city and sparked a Latino environmental justice movement, by former professor of history at Trinity University, currently the W.M. Keck Professor of Environmental Analysis at Pomona College, CHAR MILLER. On September 9th, 1921, a tropical depression stalled just north of San Antonio, and within hours overwhelmed its widening network of creeks and rivers. Floodwaters ripped through the city's Latino West Side neighborhoods, killing more than 80 people. Meanwhile, a wall of water crashed into the central business district on the city's north side, wreaking considerable damage. The city's response to this disaster, almost 100 years ago, shaped its environmental policies and local politics for the next 50+ years. In examining the intertwined environmental, social, and political histories of this event, CHAR demonstrates that disasters can expose systems of racism and injustice and lead to meaningful change. In discussion with CHAR is Dr. SARAH ZENAIDA GOULD, Executive Director of the Mexican American Civil Rights Institute, a national project to collect and disseminate Mexican American civil rights history. She's a longtime museum curator and public historian and was formerly the founding director of the Museo del West Side and lead curatorial researcher at the Institute of Texan Cultures. Gould is a co-founder and co-chair of Latinos in Heritage Conservation and serves on the board of the Friends of the Texas Historical Commission and on the Council of the American Association of State and Local History. Thank you for being with us, Sarah. You can purchase the book West Side Rising using the link in the chat or at tupress.org, and you'll receive a 20% discount by using the promo code Maverick09. Our next Maverick Book Club will be in November, discussing the new book, The Kronkosky Foundation Story, Creating Profound Good Through Community Philanthropy. Thank you for joining us. And now, please welcome CHAR MILLER and Sarah Gould.
Thank you. Thank you so much for joining us tonight, and thank you to Trinity University Press for inviting me to participate in this conversation with a scholar who I admire so much, CHAR MILLER. In addition to his work at Pomona College, CHAR is a gifted writer and the author of award-winning books, including Gifford Pinchot and the Making of Modern Environmentalism, Deep in the Heart of San Antonio, Land and Life in South Texas, and Public Lands, Public Debates, A Century of Controversy. He's also the editor of On the Border, An Environmental History of San Antonio, and 50 Years of the Texas Observer. His most recent books for Trinity University Press are Not So Golden State, Sustainability versus the California Dream, and On the Edge, Water, Immigration, and Politics in the Southwest. CHAR is a frequent contributor to print, electronic, and social media. Before we begin our conversation, I just want to remind the audience that you can put your questions in the Q&A box and we will try to answer them. Okay, it's so good to see you, CHAR.
And vice versa. And let me congratulate you on your new job. It's very exciting.
Thank you, thank you. So Tom gave us a quick overview of the book, but essentially the 1921 flood, the biggest, the most deadly flood in San Antonio's history, and across your body of work, it pops up several times. And so this new book, on my lap right here, is a much deeper dive into the 21 flood, how it happened, the repercussions. And so I'm just wondering, can you describe how this project fits into your larger body of work and how long this project was in the works?
Well, let's start with the length of time it took me to write it. It's embarrassing, but I'll say it anyway. It's about 30 years in terms of when I first learned about the flood and began to think about it, and actually maybe even earlier than that. One of my sort of first walks around where we lived in Olmos Park was to go out to the dam. And I just puzzled over that structure. I mean, first of all, it's pretty impressive. But after a while, I began to realize that that dam served one function, which is to protect downtown. But there was no such infrastructure back in the day, at least, on the west side. And that's sort of when ideas started to pop and I started talking to people around the city, basically asking all the naive questions that you would ask, which is, how come? And what's out there that I don't understand? But the other books actually were all crucial to sort of giving me what I sensed was a foundation from which to launch. And most recently, the tricentennial history that I did for the Texas State Historical Association really laid the groundwork so that I could write an environmental history as a narrative for the city, gesture towards the flood, because I knew this book was in its, not in its final stages, but was about to be. And in doing that, sort of set the stage for what would be to come.
Wow. Well, that I have to tell you, as a historian who is particularly interested in the history of the West Side, I've also been waiting for this book. So I'm very excited. I'm very excited that it's here.
Thank you.
Okay, so this was a hugely devastating flood, but it was hardly San Antonio's first or last devastating, deadly flood. Why is this area so flood prone?
Well, there's a couple of reasons for that, but let's start with the geography, which we, what environmental historians tend to do is like, okay, let's look at the place. And San Antonio is beautifully and weirdly situated at the base of the Balcones Escarpment and the Edwards Plateau lying to its north and west. But it is also where the coastal plain rises up from the Gulf of Mexico, as you can see in this image here. And those two things matter enormously because as warm, moist air moves out of the Gulf and heads up towards the plateau, it's rising the whole time. And as warm air rises, it hits cold air. And if it happens to run into a blue norther, as we like to say in San Antonio, and smacks into it, all sorts of really rollicking thunderstorms explode. This also happens when hurricanes or tropical storms work their way through and run into the same physical system, and the exact same thing happens, which is what happened in 1921. But it had also happened in 1819 when the second great flood that the city endured, and keep in mind, then it was an adobe city. So when water hits adobe, bad things happen. As bad things happened in 1921, which was a denser place with a larger population, but still built within the floodplain of the West Side Creeks and the San Antonio River. And for that, we can thank the Spanish, who platted this city in the 18th century in the same way they did for El Paso, the same way they did for Phoenix, the same way they did for Los Angeles, because they had to. If they're going to create agriculture, they need access to water. And the only way to get access to water is to put yourself inside that. But there's danger involved, as everyone in San Antonio knows.
Yeah. Okay. On September the 9th, this rain comes in, very heavy rain. Your book says something to the effect of, and correct me if I'm wrong with these numbers, downtown it was about 7 inches, but just north of downtown it was 14 plus inches. And of course that water comes roaring down. And there's a nice map there you can see. Tell me about, there was no internet, right? People couldn't text each other.
Right.
But the newspapers immediately start reporting on this. Well, maybe not quite immediately. Maybe you can fill us in on that. But there are 3 major dailies in San Antonio at this time: the Express, the Light, and La Prensa in Spanish. How did these newspapers report on the flood?
Well, it's really interesting. I have to say, thank God for digitization. And La Prensa in 1921, its issues are digitized at the Library of Congress. And so because of my very fortunate connection with Trinity, I was able to get access to the historical archives of the Light and the Express. And I started reading in the days in advance, trying to see, like, what did people talk about? Well, they were all talking about drought, including La Prensa. everybody was thinking about a drought. And then they all exulted when the rain started to fall on September 8th, early September 9th. And when you have a daily and a morning edition and an evening edition, you actually can get some really interesting reporting that takes place. And all three newspapers were thrilled that the rain started to fall. And 12 hours later, actually, they totally revised that. But you ask a really interesting question and say, okay, there's newspapers, but how did people find out about this issue? And actually, as the skies exploded in the middle of the night, the police and fire department employees, firefighters and police officers and county sheriffs, deputies, were fanning out around their neighborhoods because they're all cut off also. And so there's all of these individual stories that start to emerge after the flood of police and firefighters who are pulling people out of flood's way, out of the harm's way, but they can't connect with one another. There's no way to do it. The police department wisely sent, 2 motorcycle cops up San Pedro and Blanco road and try to find out where this flood was coming. And they had to turn around because it was coming from everywhere. And when the police understood that, that's when they called in the US Army to come down and help as well. But it's a remarkable story of how you can't know. And so the thing that was most striking, and here this photograph of the homes that were washed away by the Alazan Creek helps you understand. This is partly a consequence, the deaths and disarray and damage that occurred of not being able to communicate. It also tells you something about the wall of water that came down on those West Side creeks. Every engineer after the flood was staggered that the West Side creeks, Alazan, Apache, San Pedro, Martinez, and Zarzamora, collectively could carry as much water as the San Antonio River. And they all went, this has never happened before. Actually, it had happened before in 1914 and 1913. So they had all of the data, they just didn't believe it. And so at one level, we're looking at climate denial, that this had been going on since at least the 18th century, and there's records, as early records as they can be, in the late 18th century. And it's pretty clear how this system functioned when rain fell. But you're right, when 17 inches fall in the upper watersheds, at some point, it's going to come down to the central core. So most histories have talked about the 7 inches. Not a lot have talked about the 17, which is obviously the deadly impulse, the pulsing that came down. And here's the St. Mary Street Bridge. And I love that chair in the center. It gives you a feel that whole houses were emptied out of their furniture that all ended up against this bridge and actually took it off some of its foundations. And so, in this city of bridges, there wasn't one that wasn't damaged. And that raises questions not only about the damage, and there were hundreds of cars like this one that ended up at the parsonage, the father's house of the St. Mary Street Catholic Church, that became their own battering rams. And so the very notion of the modern infrastructure, the rail lines here in the foreground, the paving, cypress pavers that became their own battering rams, once lifted up out of their off of the ground, they just battered through windows. I mean, the city turned on itself effectively. The physical infrastructure of the city became part of what destroyed the city.
You actually opened the book with a story about a flood that happened during the Spanish era.
Yeah.
And it sounds just absolutely awful. You use a letter that the mayor sent, I believe it was. Yeah. And the thing that struck me when I was reading it is move the town because it sounded so awful. It sounded so awful, and they lost everything. Can you just explain that, and then why didn't they move the town?
Yeah, so here's an example of the demands of a certain kind of economy that required, in this case, agriculture, the city to sit within a floodplain so that the acequias, the irrigation ditches that pulled off of the river and elsewhere, could serve farmers' interests. Well, you can't move away from that system. Once you've set it up, it's impossible to move. And even though they knew the place was destroyed, and that's one of the most heart-rending letters I think I've ever read. It's just, you weep when you read it. You realize that everything was gone, including human beings, but everything. And this is at a point when San Antonio, I mean, it's totally cut off. There's no way to get support. There's no FEMA that's going to come from Monterrey, Mexico to help them out. I mean, it's just a devastating moment. But there was discussion about moving the city to up and around San Pedro Park. Like that would have been perfect. Like big open space, you're above the floodplain, and no one in the city, and this is in the 19th century, said, nah, no, forget it. This is where the city is. This is where we wish to be. That would be too hard to do. But that's also a form of climate denial. They knew by 1845 that they should either move the city or start building flood control networks. And everybody went, yeah, that's a great idea. Oh, you mean that cost money? No, thanks, no much. 1865, it happened again. The 1870s and 80s, it happened again. In 1913 and 14, a brutal set of floods, 3 floods right in a row, wiped out large parts of the city, particularly the west side, and everybody said, we must do something, and then they didn't. Does that sound familiar?
Oh, well, I don't want to skip too far ahead, but
Yeah.
it also just, it makes me think of current events, but
Yeah.
okay, but we'll get to that. We'll get to that. So just speaking of the emotional, that letter that the mayor wrote during the Spanish period, and how emotionally charged that letter was, it reminds me of another thing that you talk about in your book. So after the 1921 flood, relatively soon after the flood, a publication comes out, La Tragedia de la Inundación, a Spanish language account of what happened. Can you describe what was that and what did it reveal about the flood?
So here's a primary source that was purchased by many people on the west side at the time. There are very few physical copies left. The copy that I saw is from the UTSA archives, the University of Texas at San Antonio's archives. It had never been republished since it was published twice. So it sold so well that there was a first edition within days of the flood, and then a second edition came out later. It's the second edition that has survived, but we have our advertisements, and I use them when we publish the book ultimately later this fall, that reveal that those 2 editions existed. The source of this is never named, but the expectation is, and Kenny Walker at UTSA, I think, is absolutely right about this. He's a literary scholar who sort of worked his way through this text, that it was probably a set of journalists that revolved around Época, one of the Spanish language newspapers in town, not La Prensa. And yet no one's named, but the text is an interesting combination of investigative reporting and eyewitness accounts that are really dramatic. And the moment I saw that, it was like, okay, first of all, we need to get this thing published. But secondly, oh my God, what a treasure trove. Because it's on the ground within hours of the flood. Their reporters are moving up and down these creeks, interviewing people, and the stories that they tell, some of which are replicated in English language newspapers, but it's not as in-depth as in La Tragedia, are just heart-wrenching. Of the Zepeda family that is completely wiped out, and it does the right thing. They wake up in the middle of the night, they realize that water is entering their house, and they know enough about floods is that let's get out of here. Let's not stay, even though they lived in actually a very nice house that survived the flood. They could have survived had they stayed. But they hitched up their horse, Joe, to their wagon and took off. But unfortunately, they went into the Alazan Creek, a low water crossing. When another house comes sailing down the water, flipped the wagon, and upwards of 7 members of the family died. The oldest 2 of the family survived. But you read this story and you realize you have names, you have faces, you have people who were not victims. They were trying to save themselves. And the newspapers had other accounts like this of homemade rafts that people found on streets after the floodwaters disappeared. And you look at that and you know that that's what the reporter is signaling, that people were trying to get out of harm's way or float through it if they could. And in so doing, you get a sense that people were active agents in this. They were not just washing away. They were fighting like crazy to save their lives and of their loved ones. And then there's these other stories of people on the West Side who go into the water to pull other people out. Soldiers who save 17, 20 people at a time. And the only thing they said was, there were so many more I could have saved. But I couldn't because the branches and trunks were battering me. This young boy, Francisco, and I'm blanking on his last name at the moment, I'm sorry about that, who pulled his 5-year-old nephew up into a tree. And for 7 hours, he held on to that tree, and he had to go to hospital afterwards. I mean, he had saved the kid. The Express News thought he was the most heroic of anybody. And yet those stories are so powerful of the role that people played in trying to save themselves. And, you know, that's part of the larger story of the resilience of the West Side in the face of flood after flood after flood after flood. They knew that trees were their saviors if they could get to them. And that tells you something really powerful about their appreciation of the geography on the one hand, and the one thing that they knew would save them because nobody built flood control.
Yeah. Yeah, and one other thing I just wanted to point out about La Tragedia was that the authors were so on point about pointing out the different ways that the flood impacted downtown versus the West Side. And this is just a translation you have in your book that I would like to just read really quickly, because I think it's just so good. It says, the river swallowed pianos, velvet rugs, Venetian moons of unparalleled beauty and wealth. Alizon Creek drowned children, killed women, knocked down men. It was our people, the Mexican people, that succumbed, defeated, whose poverty did not allow them to reside in a house in a pious neighborhood, a street near the center and out of danger. The sons of Mexico were the ones that fell asleep, unperturbed by the danger, to wake up in the hands of a monster.
Yeah, I mean, when I read it, I got chills. When you read it, I just got chills. And that became sort of the one of the central themes of the book, which is that floods are episodic, like hurricanes, like earthquakes, like any kind of disaster that you can imagine. But they also reveal social structures, or can, if you're looking. We all know about Katrina and what it revealed about New Orleans in 2005. Hurricane Maria in Puerto Rico helps us understand a lot of the social class issues on that island, and also its peculiar relationship to the United States in the Trump era. And the 1921 flood just opens up this whole story of race and class, of discrimination, of spatial inequalities, all of these issues that quote captures immediately, and helped me to sort of distinguish between essentially two floods, the one that hit the downtown core and what happened after that, and the one that hit the West Side and what happened after that one.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, so in the aftermath of the flood, two major organizations come forward to help. In addition to, you mentioned the police, the firemen, the military too.
Right.
And so this is the Red Cross and the Cruz Azul. What should we know about these two organizations? Well,
first of all, you know, the Red Cross in the post-World War I period was a much stronger organization than it was prior to that point. At that point, it was mostly volunteers. Now they have a whole professional cadre situated in Washington, D.C. And I was able to find the entire run of correspondence in the Red Cross archives at the Library of Congress about the 1921 flood. And this is the backstory. And so there's a whole chapter called Rescue Mission about how the Red Cross mobilized its resources to come to San Antonio, which it had done just months before in Tulsa after the race war that had been inflicted upon African Americans there. They were also on that ground. And they set up this headquarters in Main Plaza, Military Plaza, excuse me. and utilized the resources of the city to take these cars as an example and ferry food to the West Side and clothing and other kinds of things. But they weren't the first on the ground. The first on the ground were the mutual aid societies of the West Side, the most important of which is Cruz Azul, it was a group of women. Some men were involved, but it was mostly women-led, organizers from the West Side itself, and therefore Spanish speaking, who set up their own food stations and clothing distribution sites. They had an ambulance, they had West Side doctors who treated scores of people and gave them not only food and shelter, but sort of emotional support in the depths of their despair. And like this young girl here, that's now on the cover of the book, there's an incredible resiliency is the only word I can think of. At once, folks were suffering a post-traumatic stress syndrome, as we now understand that term. But there's also this quiet strength that led Cruz Azul to be out on the ground so quickly, an organization for which no one knew anything. I mean, it had basically just been founded, but no newspaper knew much about it. And that includes La Prensa. And all of a sudden I saw these short stories in English language newspapers. And I went, wait a second, I've never heard of this group. Who are they? And then La Prensa started to publish at the same time this longer and really sort of really celebratory pieces about the women in Cruz Azul. And it becomes one of these organizations on the West Side. And San Antonio had, according to one historian, probably the greatest depth of mutual aid societies, the West Side did, of anywhere in the United States. And what Cruz Azul did was not only protect people in the post-flood period, but then they started sending out emissaries to San Marcos and New Braunfels and Austin, other towns that had also been whacked by the flood, carrying that sort of message of hope on the one hand, and also this is how you organize when you get whacked by a flood, and this is what to do. It was an astonishing display of a very small group of women who realized that it wasn't just in San Antonio, but other cities that got destroyed, or at least the Mexican neighborhoods got destroyed, that needed help, and they were there to offer that succor. It's kind of an amazing story to understand how they rallied so quickly, rallied for the community, and the leadership were the ones who were cooking the food. So they rolled up their sleeves, they're deeply engaged, whereas as good as the Red Cross was, and it was really good, the national anyway, they had the army come in to feed people. They didn't do the feeding themselves. They organized it, and that's really important. But it helps to have community organizers on the ground. The grassroots really saved the West Side.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so the West Side was the hardest hit, and we're talking about a community pretty known for its churches. And so I'm just wondering, in particular, given at the time the majority of Mexican Americans were Catholic, where was the Catholic Church in all of this? Yeah,
the Catholic Church was at front and center. In collaboration with Cruz Azul, in collaboration with the Red Cross, they were setting up separate food and shelter sites. The first night, every parish threw open its doors that weren't flooded. They became shelters for those who were unsheltered that very cold night, or what must have been felt like a very cold night. And at the midst of their despair, the doors were open, the lights were on, the priests were there, and there was a very welcoming, and I can imagine deeply needed sanctuary in every sense of that word. So they were very involved, but you know, the real player here, which again, I did not know when I started doing this part of the book 2 years ago, was Cruz Azul. And it really, I mean, I'm just blown away by what those women accomplished.
I want to follow up with our audience question, and that was, how was healthcare addressed, or I would add not addressed, on the West Side after the flood?
Yeah, no, I think your sort of flip on that question was actually the right response. So let's keep in mind that San Antonio was a deeply segregated city by wealth, by race and ethnicity, and by every other marker that one could have imagined. And the West Side was not exclusively Mexican and Mexican heritage, there were a lot of poor whites and a lot of poor blacks. In fact, one of the things that I write about is the small African-American community, which wasn't that small, almost 2,000 people who lived on the West Side with their own churches, with their own community centers and the like. What the West Side did not have and would not have really until the 1960s and 70s was a citywide healthcare system. It wasn't just impoverished, it was also the source of dysentery and a lot of communicable diseases because there was no potable water. You had to walk a long way to find that. And it's part of the disenfranchisement of the community that there were water mains in some neighborhoods and there weren't water mains in others. And in the West Side, that largely would not happen until post-World War II, that you could find potable water. And oftentimes that held out until the early 1970s. So there were a lot of public health issues that were never addressed, despite the fact that the flood revealed the sort of gap in public health outreach, healthcare outreach. And that's a really deeply disappointing part of this story, but it is consistent with other parts of the story in which we look at racism and systemic racism in particular. And the Red Cross local chapter fell prey to it, so much so that some of the correspondence that I was able to locate from the national talking about what was happening on the ground is they were really appalled by the racism that was unconscious in effect. It was just the default system in which the leadership of the local chapter, who were really good logistics, were also people who said, okay, job is done, let's walk away. The West Side doesn't really need good, substantial housing because they're happy living in shacks, which the Red Cross National went, no, that's not the way this should go, and actually proposed that the city restructure its housing in a pretty radical step that immediately the city batted away and said, no, that's not appropriate here.
That is a perfect segue to my next question.
Yeah.
Okay. So after the flood, why did the West Side become a sacrifice zone? Who made that decision and based on what?
Yeah, good. So the concept of a sacrifice zone is that certain areas, physical areas, spatial areas, are disproportionately bear the burden of, let's call, whether it's floods or toxic waste and the like. And that was one of the things that I went looking for, but in part sort of started to surface. On the West Side is where the oil tank farms were. On the West Side is where 3 different railroads cut through the neighborhood of that community, that barrio. It's where the city had its landfills. It's where there were not only union stockyards, and you can only imagine the stench that produced, but also tanneries that are even stinkier, if that's a word. So all of that was situated on the West Side. And on the one hand, it provided work, to be sure, dirty manual labor and poor paying at that, but it's work nonetheless. And yet it's also in your neighborhood, and it's not in King William, and it's not in the downtown core, and it's not on the East Side. And so it was a region in which, even in the midst of the discussion about maybe we should build flood control on the West Side post-World War flood, 1921 flood, the exact same moment they decided they were going to put another sanitary landfill. They were going to put another waste zone there, even though they knew the consequences of that, because the greatest damage were all of the horses and cattle who died that had to be incinerated where they were found. The place was a disaster on so many levels, and they added just one more thing. It's almost as if they weren't paying attention to the other side of the city saying, well, maybe we should do something better.
Okay, so the city makes this big decision, and pretty quickly, honestly, a large, expensive infrastructure project, the Almost Dam, it gets approved and it's built. I mean, I don't know, I think an infrastructure project, I think 10 years, but yeah, it's built fairly quickly. How did that happen?
Well, it happened. I mean, the fascinating thing, and I knew this pretty early on when I started gathering material in the 1990s, is that this dam was being discussed, had been discussed before, actually all the way back to 1845. So everybody knew that this stretch on the west side of this dam that you're looking at is a community called Olmos Park. You can see some new housing going in, and that's why that housing is going in. It's on high ground and it's behind the dam. Where we are looking in the foreground is a community called Alamo Heights. For those who don't know, it is those two communities are among the highest valued landscapes in the city, and the site tells you almost everything. But the Express News, even as it's pumping out its press room, is writing an editorial. That's how quickly they flipped on this, saying we got to have that dam. All of a sudden, we have to have that dam. And so the discourse about that flood shifted radically from the death, damage, and disarray on the west side to this other story about building a dam, a massive dam that would cost millions to build. And also let's straighten the river. Let's concretize its banks and its bed. Let's transform this thing that has been killing us for so many years. And looking at the dam, it looks really solid. But another set of documents that I was able to unearth, first at the University of California, Berkeley, and now at the University of California, Riverside, were a series of engineer reports that were written right exactly at the moment this dam was completed in 1926 and late and early 27, that said that dam, totally wrongly built. Got a lot of concrete in it, but it is weak in its bones. And I looked at that and went, oh my God, the thing, thank God it survived. And was never overtopped, because if it had been overtopped, that means water spilling over the top, it would have undercut the dam. The dam would have imploded and downtown would have been wiped out forever, or not forever, but certainly right away. But they were lucky, it didn't happen. And that dam also then helped us as a city, outside capital and internal capital poured into the downtown core, building the Tower Life building, building Alamo Bank, National Bank building, and a series of other 10, 12, 15-story buildings that totally changed downtown San Antonio, resegregated where work happened, and people in office towers did not interact with people who were not in office towers, as a kind of separation by occupation. And so the dam did what it was supposed to do, which is to protect private capital, using public monies to do that. The same didn't happen on the west side, though I have to say, there was the gesture. In fact, Mayor Tobin, who got the money, the bond to build the dam and redo the river, got a bunch of money that he was going to use on the west side. I went through every city council meeting records, and thank God the Bexar County has, and the city has digitized all of that stuff, looking for how they spent the money. And there appears, and I say this with scare quotes around it, because it only appears that some work was done at the confluence of San Pedro Creek and the San Antonio River to widen and deepen that space, because that was one of the great trouble spots. As the waters poured together, it just like became a whirlpool. It appears, and I'm even less certain about this appearance, that they did similarly at the Alazan Creek's convergence with San Pedro Creek. And I say that because the documentation for 10 years is pretty slim about where the money actually went, because of cost overruns on the river. And it cost a lot to straighten out roughly 3 miles of that river, concretize it, and the like. Money was siphoned. I'm convinced of it. They don't say it, but I'm pretty convinced that it was moved over to this much more expensive project that kept getting more expensive. And by 1929, the city was sick of spending money on flood control. And one of the ways to track what Mayor Tobin wanted to have happen, didn't have happen, is to look at the 1935 flood, look at the 1946 flood, look at floods in the 1950s, right up through the mid-1960s. Every one of them, reporters from the Express News and or Light would say, the same places that flooded, the old trouble spots, as one of them put it, were troublesome again. There were shacks that were ripped away. There were small houses that were plowed through by floodwaters on the west side. And you look at where that happened, and then you think about what happened in 21, and it's the exact same space. So what was planned was never realized.
Mm-hmm. And the residents of the west side didn't really have a lot of options. in terms of, right, in terms of those little houses being rebuilt without proper foundations and that sort of thing. I mean,
Well,
they
if
just
you
really
don't
didn't have a lot of
money,
options.
yeah, if you don't have a lot of money, you can't do it. And if you're renting it, the landlord isn't going to do it. And there's a story in the book about one of these, let's call him a slumlord, because I think that's what he was, who had 17 houses along Alazan Creek. He was able to recover, even though he lost all of those houses, and the people in them lost either themselves and or their possessions, and he just rebuilt them. And by 1939, the West Side had the exact same shack infrastructure, crowding along the exact same creeks that had blown up in the 1921 flood. And so much so that national reporters came to town and called San Antonio the shame of Texas, by which they meant it was the shame of the United States, for all of these environmental issues that had never been corrected.
Mm-hmm. Yep, yep. Okay, so earlier you mentioned Cruz Azul as a mutual aid society that was helping West Side residents. And now you've told us that the flood abatement was really centered around building Almost Down, protecting downtown, protecting economic interests, allowing us to build the skyscrapers downtown and all of that. And so post 21, post Almost Down, floods come every season to the West Side, people die over and over, years pass. Now there's a big flood in 1974 again in the West Side, but this time there's something different. This time there's a group of people calling themselves cops. Tell us about that.
Yeah, so here's another one of those success stories that I knew about, but the depth of it I didn't know. Until I started digging through. Again, the newspapers were really tracking a lot of this. There is good oral histories that have been done for people in COPS and also people who are allied with COPS in various ways. But so here's the story that a 1974 flood on Zarzamora Creek spilled over its banks once again. No one was killed, but a bridge was knocked off its foundations. Houses were flooded, cars were destroyed, all of the usual things that happen whenever a flood hit the West Side that had been true in 35 and 46 in the 50s and in the 60s, but now erupted again in the 1970s. Only this time, there was another grassroots organization that had been emerging and quietly campaigning for the previous 2 years, led by the brilliant organizer, Ernie Cortez, working with women, by and large, but not exclusively, through parish organizations, one-on-one interviews. Cortez thought he'd done at least 1,000 or more interviews with individuals in small groups, trying to find out, what are your felt needs? What do you think the West Side requires? Number one, drainage, flood control. Everything else depended on that. And so part of what he's doing over those 2 years before the 74 flood is to not only listen deeply, but also say, what I hear you saying is that you really need flood control of one form or another. And everybody was going, yeah, of course we do. This has been paramount in our lives. Our children will know it. Our grandparents knew it. Our great-great-grandparents understood it back to the 1921 flood. So the 1974 flood happened. And that's when COPS emerged in a way that I find exhilarating on the one hand and absolutely fascinating on the other. And they'd had it. That's it, right? The slow violence that had been perpetuated, this constant hammering, so much so you just think it's normal. And that you feel that you have no way to stop it because it's just what happens. And you have no political authority, you have no political power, no one particularly interested in you or what your felt needs are, except Ernie and the group that he is organizing. So one of the ways that COPS, this Communities Organized for Public Services, realized that it now had a moment in time where it could strike while that flood was deep in the memory of the West Side, was to call a public meeting, demand that the city manager, who was basically the lead organizer of the city, wasn't elected, wasn't an appointed official, to come to a public meeting. Never happened before. And what a public meeting it was. And the records and the oral histories are like these vivid accounts of the city manager coming in, not knowing what was about to happen, but fair game, like he went, okay, good for you. And they just clobbered him. They had a slideshow showing the devastation of the 74 flood. They had person after person stand up and testify that this violence, this environmental violence that they had been subjected to since time immemorial, effectively within the city's modern history anyway, had to stop. And he was appalled because he didn't know. And what I'm fascinated by is he's the city manager. He manages the city's lifeblood, and he doesn't know the story, which means he probably never crossed San Pedro Creek. And again, lots of people had never crossed San Pedro Creek, but that was about to change because COPS was forcing the issue. And I need to backstory this a little bit. In 1960, Henry B. Gonzalez had been elected congressman in a very contested election, which he actually won quite easily because he was a brilliant campaigner. Nobody in the Anglo elite wanted Henry B. to represent the city. What Henry B. did the moment he got to the city, to the Hill, Congress, was to begin to gain not just the seniority, but the trust of the Democratic Party leadership and say, look, I come from the West Side. No one's been paying attention. We can't get the local government to do anything. I need federal money. And a flood in 1965 gave him the access point to this issue. He brought a whole delegation of congressional figures to San Antonio, and he did it to embarrass the city. And boy, did he embarrass them. And this congressional delegation started talking to the mayor, to the city, to the council, to the county judge who runs the county political system, called him on the carpet. Said, you've been getting money from the Army Corps of Engineers to do work on the West Side, and you have not done it. You've moved it to the East Side, where there is no one, on Salado Creek and elsewhere, but you haven't done it where you said you would. This has got to change. So Henry is the first sort of top-down voice that begins to raise this question. What COPS does is the bottom-up voice, the grassroots, saying, okay, now we're sick of this. And we're going to call the question on the city manager. And then they said, so if you don't solve these issues, who does? And he said, city council. He said, put us on the agenda. They came to the city council and it didn't know what was about to happen to it. And in a meeting that has taken on a legendary cast, the city council just got roasted. And usually city council meetings are pretty, pro forma and generous and polite affairs. This was not a polite crowd. 500 people crowded into the city council chambers and just wailed on the city council representatives. The mayor turns to the city manager and said, is what they're saying true? And he goes, yeah, there actually was money encumbered that we have never spent on the West Side. And credit the mayor who said, you got 4 hours, find the money, come back to this room, and let's start distributing it the way we said we would. Okay, like when has that ever happened in American political history? But to your point, the key is not just that it happened once, but it happened repeatedly for the next decade, in which COP wrested model city monies and other kinds of federal funds, state monies, and especially the city budget, and turned a $500 million outlay, $500 million to a West Side that had never seen anything like this before. So what COPS's sort of streetscape environmentalism, which included drainage, street hardening, I mean, there are so many dirt roads on the West Side, getting potable water. Let's have some water mains, for God's sakes. Why is this a hard thing for a city to have managed? Let's get healthcare over here. All of the things that could have made the West Side habitable after the 21 flood that people did talk about, they just never did anything with. COPS now wrangled between 1974 and the mid-1980s. In addition to which, they also blew apart the city charter, got at-large districts, changed into site-specific districts, managed to get Henry Cisneros first elected as a city councilman, and then the next thing you know, he's the mayor of the city. And that, I mean, if you look at that short time frame, Henry B is elected in 1960. Mayor Henry Cisneros goes in the mid-1980s. That's not a lot of time. to move so much political change. And of course, there's arguments, and rightly so, that as one historian has called it, it's the illusion of inclusion. And that's a fair point. But it's also fair to recognize that the doors were slammed open by grassroots organizers and others who then did what Cruz Azul did. They took their story to El Paso, to Houston, to Chicago, to Los Angeles. Ernie Cortez ultimately went to Chicago to replicate exactly what he did in San Antonio. San Antonio served as Atlanta did for the African-American civil rights movement, as the source of bodies and ideas that moved across the United States and fundamentally changed certainly the Southwest, and I would argue also political life in Chicago and places like it.
Mhm. We have an audience question asking what explains the fact that City Council was so oblivious to this long history of flooding on the West Side. And then another audience member was asking about single member districts. So maybe you could try to tackle those together.
Sure. So one of the reasons why they were oblivious is they wish to be oblivious, right? Ignorance is willed, or can be. And in this case, it was. And if you have at-large elections, that is to say, everybody ran at a citywide level, those with the capital, name recognition, support from power brokers of whatever type they may be, tended to get on. Actually, I say tended. They always got on to the city council. There was a rare insurgent candidate who could get onto this process. And part of what, and that's really sort of post-World War I, post-World War II, part of that consequence is that they felt that they were elected, yes, citywide, but in their heads, the city meant the North Side and the downtown core. And that's a kind of myopia that's deliberate. If you lived in a place that was above water, and San Antonians did, and it's a really interesting, let me take you back to 1919. There's a fabulous map that one of my students did years ago, Dan Galindo. And he looked at the streetcars of, I said, look, there were 19 streets. Where did they end? Where did they end? They ended at Prospect Hill, which is the slight rise on ground on the west side. They went to Government Hill, which is where Fort Sam Houston is. They went to Denver Heights. Please note the last name in all of these places. Alamo Heights, Beacon Hill, Monte Vista, and places like that. It's all high ground. So the moment the streetcars are laid out in the first 20 years of the 20th century, going out on those lines to the high ground were those who could afford to purchase what is now going to be higher priced property. And you can see that by the old buildings around on Government Hill and Denver Heights. And then when the car comes in, you can follow that same trajectory out to Terrell Hills, Alamo Heights, and Olmos Park, where I lived. And that was one of the things that stunned me when Judy and I moved to Olmos Park, is like, wait a second, this is an automobile suburb. And I kept getting lost. And I couldn't figure it out. I walk around and I keep getting lost because they're curvilinear streets. And so I wrote to the guy we bought our house from. He said, oh, that was deliberate. That was to keep people out. Ooh, there's a story here. Like, how do you keep people out? Well, it turns out you have covenants that say only white people can live here. And if there is a Mexican American or African American, they will be chauffeurs, they will be cooks, they will be domestics, but they will not live there. And so you start to see not only internal to a household, the hierarchy that a covenant defines, expand that, extrapolate that across the city. And that's why you could grow up in neighborhoods that are all white and not understand that there were other neighborhoods, or you did understand, and that's where your family's money was coming from the pecan shelling industries and others. And it was like, you know, they're manual labor. They live where they live. And that's too bad. So that's one of the reasons why, until you turn it into single member districts, you can't get representation, real representation on the east side, the south side, and the west side. And the moment that happened, literally the face of city council changed. And that's when the city starts to become a real human-centered community for the first time.
what you use some powerful analytical concepts in this book. And one of the ones is this idea that you mentioned a while back, slow violence. And you also talk a lot about spatial inequality. I'm wondering if you could describe those terms to us a little bit, because I think for me, particularly learning about slow violence was I think I'm going to start using that. So
Oh yeah, no,
it's
a great concept. It comes from a literary critic by the name of Rob Nixon. And one of the things he was interested in his book by that title, Slow Violence, and which my students and I read rigorously every other year, was to ask, why is it that neighborhoods, barrios, and the like are disproportionately burdened, whether it's air pollution in Los Angeles, flooding in San Antonio, hurricanes in the Ninth Ward in New Orleans. Why does that happen? And why is it perpetuated across time? So he's talking, here we have like flash floods or quick violence, but flash floods repeatedly in the same neighborhood is slow violence. If that helps you understand what Nixon was talking about, that it just becomes ingrained in the system because you don't break the system. And you go, well, but that's just those folks. I'm above ground, right? And so elevated above the floodplain. And so you become a victim of slow violence that is perpetuated by other people who do not feel it. And that's also what spatial inequality implies as well, that where we live, the space, the site, is also determinative of how you experience life in a city like San Antonio, and again, like Los Angeles and other places. This is not endemic and only San Antonio. And Nixon's book, for example, is quite global in this regard. But if you live in a flatland, a floodplain, why do you live there? Why can't you move out? Well, because you can't afford to buy. You live in a neighborhood that's been redlined, as the West Side was, which meant that mortgage lenders would not lend you money to buy property there and build intergenerational wealth. That was true in Atlanta for African Americans, as it was true in San Antonio. And one of the things that one of my students did was to look at the redlining map of the city and then place on top of it the floodplain of the 1921 flood. And what a shock. The same situation is being played out along the creeks where all of the redlined neighborhoods that no one could own a house because you couldn't get a mortgage, except for very few people who were fortunate in that regard. So spatial inequities mean that you're also not able to get potable water. There are no water mains there. So you had to walk a mile, perhaps, to find a faucet. Well, that's a spatial inequality because 2 miles away, somebody flipped a faucet and just turned it on and there was water. Why? Because the city paid for them to have a water main, but decided that the West Side didn't have enough capital and the city didn't want to sink its money into some place and provide a utility for those who it felt couldn't pay for it, by which they meant didn't deserve it. Another form of slow violence.
Char, I have to tell you, there are so many dramatic moments in this story, whether we're talking about the flood and the stories of individuals and families, some lives lost, some saved, or whether we're talking about the fact that it takes 50 years, more than 50 years, to really address the flooding situation on the West Side and all of the people who are involved in trying to create that change. It's so dramatic. Any idea if this book might be made into a movie?
I would love it to be a documentary at least. And if Alex Gibney is on, Alex, I do know you. It would be a great thing to have happen. Your question is important because effectively it's a story that, and I'm so grateful to have the chance to have told it, that has not been told, that actually is crucial to understand in terms of San Antonio's history, but this history is consistent with other places. And so much as we do in feature-length films, and if Netflix is interested, I can see a multiple episode story, nicely, beautifully produced, that helps us understand how a community that is battered and vulnerable and dispensable as far as the power elite is concerned, decides otherwise and decides its fate otherwise, and uses every political tactic it possibly can. Henry B going to Congress, Henry Cisneros getting into the mayorship, ripping up the charter. This is not something that has happened elsewhere in quite the same way. And so it's at once really dramatic, good for television, and is also really good, it seems to me, for carrying a case for how we're going to make our communities more just, how we're going to make them more habitable, how we're going to make them more environmentally green, which is also where I wanted this story to end, not because I wanted it to, but because that's what the West Side has proved itself to do. And here we look at how those creeks have turned in not to flood control ditches only, but also recreational zones. An absolutely brilliant idea that has a long gestation in San Antonio, but Julian Castro and Howard Peake and a whole bunch of other people really pushed this notion that those creeks could be linear parks. Creeks that were the source of death and damage now become the source of the community's health and recreational possibilities. That's an incredible story.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we actually have a couple of different people who have asked about the connections between this and the modern environmental movement. One person in particular is asking about, do you have any thoughts on the modern day environmental organizing in San Antonio and various efforts to, for example, shut down the coal plants and things like that. But also a question from another audience member about environmentalism is often considered kind of a wealthy white issue. And so how do we expand that?
Well, I think COPS is the expansion of that. Yeah. It demonstrates loudly, as any COPS member will tell you, that it isn't just a white middle class, upper middle class vision, although that has historically been how it is described. And frankly, in some of my early writings, that's the world that I have articulated. But it's very clear that COPS's role in boosting what we now think of as an environmental justice movement, which is often thought of as a movement that emerged in the early 1980s in North Carolina in response to a landfill that was going into a rural African-American neighborhood. I think I've got an earlier story that is consistent, but that also does something really crucial. If you look at what COPS did in the city in the immediate aftermath of its assault upon City Hall and its politics, it reached out to white environmentalists on the north side to develop a coalition to protect the Edwards Aquifer, because everybody's water came from the same source. So it's everybody's problem. It reached out to the east side to connect with what's now COPS Metro, is a symbol of that connectivity, that intersectional relationship. It worked with groups on the south side, white and Hispanic, that are fighting landfills and other sacrifices that they had borne for decades. And then when it takes off for Los Angeles and Chicago and elsewhere, it's carrying a message that streetscape issues, roads, water, flood control, public health, that whole constellation of issues is absolutely crucial. And that's from the bottom up saying, we want better lives. You can trace this back deep in time, deep as an American history time goes, like into the late 19th, early 20th century, where urban reformers of all stripes are arguing against air pollution, against diseases, against the sacrifice zones that existed in New York City and other places. But what COPS did is bring it to the Southwest and identify San Antonio as a place where we've got a different story. And that story needs to be told, and it's going to be told with the blunt force of political power. And that blunt force has been really powerful. It's kind of amazing.
Yeah. I don't know where all the time went. It's a little after 7. I have a couple more questions, if
Please,
that's okay.
Go for it.
Okay.
If the audience can stay for it, let's do it.
Okay. Firstly, how should the 1921 flood be remembered by the city, meaning elected officials who get to make decisions, as well as the public, especially as natural disasters are becoming more common with climate change?
Yeah, well, I think that may be one of the reasons, right? We can use the 1921 flood to have a conversation, not just in San Antonio, but elsewhere, about what wasn't done, right? So if we have a climate denial that, I don't really believe this stuff, or I don't want to invest in it, and let's have the conversation about what happened in San Antonio in 1921 as a direct reflection of climate denial for more than a century. And the more than 80 people who died paid the cost for that climate denial. The West Side would continue to pay that same cost right up until the 1970s, early 1980s. That's a long time to suffer because some people thought it wasn't worth investing in. I think there's a global conversation that has to happen. I mean, literally global, that San Antonio speaks to. At some point, you have got to step in and intercede in the things that you know are killing you. And it isn't just about flood control, though it's that. It's about all of these slow violence issues of health and the like that are driving the story. I mean, we have wildfires in California that have been driven to an intensity unseen before because of climate change. We have islands that are disappearing because of climate change. We have societies that are being disrupted already. We have species that are struggling to survive because we have not acted. And we have all the data we need to have to do that, just as they did in 1921, just as they did in 1845, but refused to do the thing that they should have done, at least in retrospect. And so that's part of what our documentary series could do. It is part of what I think San Antonio helps focus us on. But you asked the question, like, locally, what should we be doing? Well, I think one of the things that the West Side History Conference that you have been organizing is doing is calling attention to neighborhoods that have been still neglected, but have this rich history that you're trying to recover. And it's in the recovery process of history, it seems to me, that we get to tell stories that have not been told, that have been subdued in some fashion or another, or have simply been erased or forgotten. And one of the reasons I'm really interested in that, I used at the end of that first chapter that talks about the death and damage. I spotted this line in the San Antonio Light that dumbfounded me. It was published in 1926, and it was talking about why we needed to do something for the West Side, even though they weren't going to do it. And it said, because a few people died in the 1921 flood. 5 years later, it had gone from 80 people to a few people. And that's an historic memory lapse that, frankly, staggered me. The families didn't forget. The community didn't forget. And in fact, one of the families named their subsequent children after those that were swept out of their arms, which, like, the moment I saw that, I went, oh my God, because they wanted to remember. And those children were the markers. If you walk through San Fernando Cathedral, which COVID allowing we could have done on the centennial day, you pass by monuments to people who died. We need to have these stories told so that those monuments aren't the only thing that we know. And that's true of a lot of sort of political issues, but we get to talk about the 21 flood that is now memorialized in a massive dam. But that isn't the only story that needs to be told, even though that's the story that San Antonio liked to tell the moment that dam went up. One of my favorite photographs among many, in addition to the one on the cover, and if Bergen, if you're listening, if you could pop up the photograph of the shack that Russell Lee took in 1939, looking towards the downtown core. It's a really powerful image that Russell Lee, who was a New Deal photographer, which meant he got to roam around the country taking photographs, he immediately understood the relationship between that shack in the foreground, San Fernando Cathedral, where everyone was buried, or virtually everyone was buried at the 21 flood. And to the right, the Smith Young Tower, Tower Life Building, the Alamo National Bank, and all of the other high rises that are starting to pop up. That shack is inhabited, and it's 1.5 miles away from those skyscrapers. There were two cities. There was this city on the west side that still bore the devastation of flood and disarray and also disregard. And then there was another city, a gleaming city, 1.5 miles away, that served the interests of those of private capital and wealth, who probably didn't even live in San Antonio any longer. They lived in the incorporated suburbs of Olmos Park, Alamo Heights, and Terrell Hills, or they lived in Monte Vista and elsewhere. And those two worlds never intersected. And Russell Lee, with one photograph and no words, tells the story of the continued immiseration of the West Side until the West Side finally rose up and dramatically revealed a very different story that had been there all along. But they revealed it in a way that was, I still think, is one of the most extraordinary political transformations in American history.
Absolutely, absolutely. I know there's so much more we could talk about, but I'm going to try to wrap it up. So Char, what's next for you? Is there another San Antonio book in you?
Well, I'm open to suggestions. I'm actually working on a book on fire because, like, you know, my state is on it, is in it. And that seemed a logical place to go. But like the San Antonio book, which is so predicated on these first-person stories, that's part of what I'm doing, is trying to go back and look at who decided that we were going to suppress wildfires that then have done the exact opposite of what that policy was designed to do, which was to stamp out fire. What it actually did was incentivize those fires to emerge. And I've got a lot of data now, and it's a question of, like, how fast can I type, and the like.
Well, and I think, you know, something that I think a lot of us saw this summer, the way the wildfires have impacted the farm workers. And even years ago, there was a big one in wine country in California. Again, mostly Latino farm workers in those grape fields, continuing to pick with all the darkened skies and the smoke. And
because you need the work. And yet that puts you in such a terrible position. I was with one of my sisters who was waiting in an emergency room in Northern California. The emergency room is filled with COVID patients. The outside is choking on wildfire smoke. And she decided that one was more dangerous than the other. And we sat outside, right? So there are choices that, I mean, we make choices, but not getting vaccinated is a bad one. Allowing fires to burn to such an extent that they are, and neither of those things are good, right? And those require public policy initiatives and interventions. And we've not been very good about that. We're very short-term in our thinking. And I think what the book is trying to argue for is, let's think long-term and let's think about justice issues when we do that. Not just, you know, short-term personal gain, but real social justice issues, much like the Mexican American Civil Rights Institute does.
well, listen, we didn't get to all of the questions. There are a lot of questions.
Yeah.
So I apologize if I didn't get your question. However, CHAR is going to be coming to San Antonio in November. On November 20th, we have the West Side History Symposium, which will be at the Guadalupe Theater, but it will also be broadcast online. More information will be coming soon about that. I suspect that any other talking events you get with this book will also be promoted by Trinity University Press. So be sure to follow Trinity University Press online, sign up for their newsletter at tupress.org. Also, order your book. If you go to tupress.org and use the promo code Maverick09, you can get 20% off. It's really good. Mine is full of notes now. Really, really good. I'm so glad you wrote this, Char. It's a book that we've been waiting for. West Side history does not get enough attention. And so I thank you for writing this book. I know it's going to be a treasure in my collection. So I want to thank everybody who joined us tonight. And I want to thank you, Char. And I'll say good night.
Thank you all so much for coming. And thank you, Sarah. Beautiful job.